Good morning, Jupiter and I. Say hello. Um, we are still reading The People of Sparks, obviously. We are on chapter 13. It is called Taking Action. And I just realized it is the last chapter in part 1. One evening, Dune wandered off by himself toward the far corner of the hotel, where the trees grew thickly and the undergrowth beneath them was dense. He made his way into the woods to a thicket of vines, all woven together like thorny ropes. Little lumpy fruits, some red and some black, grew on these vines. Dune had already discovered that the red ones were hard and sour, but if left to ripen, they turned black and sweet. He had been checking the vines regularly. Each day there were more and more of the black ones. Today he saw there were more blackberries than red. He began picking them. Some he ate right from the vine. They were sweet and juicy. Others he put into a basket he would bring with him and take back to the others in room 215. He heard footsteps behind him, a voice he instantly recognized, calling out, Dune! He turned, and there was Tick striding toward him, smiling his dazzling smile. Dune stood up. He'd been squatting to reach for the berries on the lowest vines. Look what I found, he said, holding out a handful of berries to Tick. Tick took one and popped it into his mouth. His eyebrows shot up in surprise. Terrific, he said. He took the rest of them from Dune's palm. So, he said, are you going to save us again? Save us? Said Dune, confused. Yes, from starvation. You are the hero of Ember. It's about time for you to save us again. It flustered Dune to be called a hero. He wasn't sure if Tick was admiring him or making fun of him. He couldn't think of what to say next. Tick reached into the thicket and plucked a few berries for himself. These are good, he said. Mind if I take some? They don't belong to me, said Dune. Anyone can have them. Tick hunted along the vines for a while, picking berries and popping them into his mouth. Then he said, You know that building they call the Ark? Dune nodded. Ever been in it? No, Dune said. Just in the separate room at the back. They have books in there. You should see them. There must be thousands. Tick didn't comment on the books. I went in there the other day, he said. They had me carrying a crate of pickled beets. It's their storehouse, you know. They say they're short of food. Ha! Tick gave a laugh. That place is full of food. Really? Said Dune. Really, said Tick, tossing 3 berries into his mouth. There's jars of preserved fruit, sacks of dried fruit, every kind of pickle and bags of corn, loads and loads of food. And we get limp carrots for our dinner. I believe they're being a bit stingy. Dune frowned. He thought of his father looking with dismay last night at the scanty contents of his dinner parcel. He thought about what Ornine had said at lunch the week before. We just don't have enough for 400 extra people. Was it really untrue after all? Tick had moved a few steps away and found a patch that was thick with berries. He was picking them rapidly, eating each one. When he spoke, his words sounded a little juicy. I don't know about you, he said, but I don't like unfairness. I don't either, said Dune. He walked over to Tick and offered him a handful of berries he had just collected. Tick took them all. I believe an unfair situation needs to be corrected, Tick said. Corrected how? Tick wiped his red-stained fingers on his pants. Well, he said, that's something we have to figure out. We, thought Dune. He liked that. Though he stopped taking part so often in Tick's projects, still he admired his energy and felt his power. He was glad Tick had sought him out. He was glad that Tick seemed to consider him different from the others, smarter, more important. You're right, he said. We should do something. Tick nodded. I don't trust these people, he said. In some ways they seem very primitive. Do you think that they make fire by hitting stones together? They do. Dune hadn't seen anyone starting a fire since he was rarely in any kitchens. He knew that the fire in the bakery was kept going all the time. He had seen people going in there sometimes carrying candles that had gone out. They don't have matches? He said. Sometimes they do, said Tick, but not always. Matches seem to be rare. We should give them some of ours, said Dune. All the people who'd come out of Ember had the matches that were supplied with the boats. The Emberites had hundreds of matches. Oh, I don't think so, Tick said quickly. We need them. We have to keep those for ourselves. Dune wondered why, when they had so many, but he thought maybe matches figured somehow in Tick's plan. So you're with me? Said Tick. Sure, said Dune. Then he hesitated. With you in what? Action, said Tick. You took action before, when there was an urgent situation. We may need to take action again soon. Dune still didn't know what Tick had in mind, but he asked no more questions. Tick had a way of letting you know that he'd given all the answers he was going to give. All right, Dune said. I'm with you. Good, said Tick. He held out his hand and Dune shook it. Tick grinned and walked away. Dune watched him lope across the field. For a moment he was lost in his thoughts. Food in the storehouse? Stinginess? Unfairness? Figure something out. You're with me. When he came to himself again and glanced down at his hands, he was startled to see them streaked with blood. Had he scratched himself on the thorns on the vines? It took him to realize that what looked like blood was only berry juice, passed on his hand from ticks. Lena made a plan. She'd hide among the boxes and crates on Casper's truck, and she would ride the way to the city. It was only a day's journey away. Surely she'd be able to find a way back. There must be other roamers on the roads. Of course, she could just ask Casper if he could go on with him, but she was sure he would say no. He was on some kind of important business. He wouldn't want to be bothered with her. It was best to go secretly. Once she had seen the city, she would know if it was a place where the people of Ember were destined to live. She was sure she'd know as soon as she saw it. Then she could hop out of the truck and find her way back. Casper might never see her at all. The next day, she tore part of a blank page out of one of the doctor's book and wrote a note. Dear Mrs. M, I have gone with Casper and Maddie on the truck. I will be back in 2 days or maybe 3. There is something important I want to find out. Also, I need a change. See you soon. Love, Lena. Her plan was to wait until that night when Mrs. Murdo was asleep and tuck the note between the pages of the ancient, crumbling book she had been reading, something called Charlotte's Web. She kept urging Lena to look at it, but Lena said she wasn't that interested in spiders. It would be better for Dune. Mrs. Murdo read only in the evening, so Lena would have at least a day's head start before anyone knew where she was. A few doubts about her plans lurked in the back of Lena's mind. She knew Mrs. Murdo would worry about her. Poppy would miss her, and Lena didn't really like Casper or trust him, and she knew that he and Maddie would probably be angry if they found out that she did come along. It was a bit of a risky journey she was embarking on, but anything truly important involved risk, doesn't it? She had taken a huge risk before in the last days of Ember, and it had been the right thing to do. So probably this was the right thing to do. She was so sure the city was her destination, and she was determined to see the city for herself, that she turned her mind away from her doubts. It would be an adventure, she told herself. She would be fine. She got up before the sun the next morning. She crept out of her bed on the floor, one tiny motion at a time. Poppy didn't stir, nor did Mrs. Murdo in her bed on the couch. In the half-darkness, Lena put her clothes on and pulled the pillowcase bag she had packed the night before from its hiding place in the window seat. She tucked her note between the pages of Mrs. Murdo's book. Then, carrying her bag, she opened the door so softly it made no noise and went out into the courtyard. Just beyond the gate, the truck was standing ready. The oxen weren't attached to it yet. They were down the road at the barn to be brought later by the stable hand. Lena climbed onto the back of the truck. Its metal bottom was pretty with dust and bits of dry grass. It was loaded with 4 large barrels, 2 bicycles strapped together, a box full of tubs and buckets, and 4 big wooden crates made of slices of wood spaced about an inch apart. The crates were taller than Lena and about 4 feet square, like small rooms almost. 3 of them were full of goods to be sold, but the 4th was empty. Its contents had been sold in sparks. That one would be Lena's hiding place. Getting into it was easy. First, she tossed her bag over the side, and then she climbed up the slats as if they were a ladder and jumped down in. The wood was rough and splintery, but she had prepared for that. She had brought a small blanket from her bed. She spread this on the bottom of the crate and lay down on it, using her bag of supplies as a pillow. She was sure that if she laid very still, no one would see her. And she was right. An hour or so later, she didn't know for sure how long, but the sun was now shining through the slates in the crate, and she could feel its warmth on her back. She heard the clatter of the gate latch and voices. Torrance first. "But I'd be helpful," he said in a tearful, desperate wail. "I would. I know how to tie knots, and I can—" "That's enough," said Casper. "You are not coming with us. Get it through your hard little head. You're not old enough. Roaming is a dangerous business. It's not for children." "She gets to go," Torrance said. "Of course, she's not a child. She's my partner." Lena felt a jolt as the box holding Casper's and Maddie's belongings was heaved up onto the truck. "Here comes Joe with the oxen, right on time," said Casper. The truck squeaked and trembled as the oxen were hitched to it. Lena heard the gate latch clatter again, and then the doctor's voice. When will you be back anyway? Not for a while, the truck slanted as Casper got on. Several months is my guess. We've got a big route planned out. You should be taking me, cried Torin. You'll be sorry you didn't. I'm going to tell on you. I'll tell Uncle. Casper chuckled. Uncle would not be interested. He's much too busy. Always has been. There was the crack of the whip. Goodbye, little brother, Casper called, and the truck jolted forward. Part 2 is called Travelers and Warriors. So here we have Tick and Dune are gonna, sounds like they're gonna come up with an action plan about feeding the people of Ember. And here Lena thinks that she was sneaking off for maybe a few days' journey, and now Casper is saying he's planning on being gone for a few months. Part 2, Travelers and Warriors. Excuse me. Chapter 14, What Torin Did. All day after Casper and Maddie left, Mrs. Murdo wondered where Lena was. Had the doctor sent her on an errand? She asked, but the answer was no. Did Torin know where she was? He said he didn't know, and he didn't care. Thinking maybe Lena had gone to the Pioneer Hotel to see Dune, Mrs. Murdo walked down there, but no one had seen her. By evening, when Lena was still missing, Mrs. Murdo was getting worried. She found the note in her book that night. She frowned as she read it. This didn't seem like a good idea to her. It was one of Lena's rash, impulsive acts, and probably was dangerous. Will you give me some water? Mrs. Murdo went downstairs, knocked on the doctor's door, and showed her the note. Can we send someone after them, she said, to bring her back? But the doctor shook her head. They're a whole day ahead, she said. No one could catch up, even if we could find someone willing to go. So Mrs. Murdo went back to bed and tried to sleep. She told herself that Lena had survived many dangers before, but she still laid awake worrying most of the night.
Here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi.
In the morning at breakfast, Torin asked where Lena was, and Mrs. Murdo told him. He jumped up from his chair. He threw down his piece of bread while bouncing on the table. She went with them? She went with Casper? He cried. Calm down, said Dr. Hester. No, I won't calm down. I hate her. I hate all you cave people. Why did you have to come here and ruin everything? With a furious swipe of his hand, he knocked over Mrs. Murdo's cup of tea. He kicked backward at his chair, which fell over, and he ran out of the room. Through the window, Mrs. Murdo saw him racing across the courtyard and out the gate. Jealous, said the doctor. He wants Casper all to himself. Heaven knows why. That boy craves attention, said Mrs. Murdo. I doubt that he cares who it really comes from. I suppose you're right, said the doctor, looking at Mrs. Murdo with a faint surprise. Torin sped down the river road, full of boiling rage. He was the one who should be sitting beside Casper, not that fat Maddie and that stupid cave girl. He should be there riding on the truck, going away to be a roamer, but she had snuck off and done it anyways, and he hated her for it. It was the worst thing that had happened to him in his whole life. He ran a long way, his feet pounding the dusty road, his fists pumping back and forth, furious tears streaming down his face. When he stopped panting, he was all the way out in the tomato field, not far from the wind tower where he had been the day the cave people came over the hill. He remembered how they had looked, like a swarm of horrible insects coming down toward the village. Now the cave people had settled in as if they were going to stay forever. They were eating food that should belong to Sparks people. They were wearing clothes that Sparks people had given them. They walked around in the streets of Sparks as if they belonged there. Torin wanted them gone. He stomped among the tomato plants, throwing punches at the air. Get out of here! Get out! He cried, as if Lena and all the Emberites were there to hear him. His thoughts were like flames inside his head. He kept seeing Casper on the seat of his truck with Maddie on one side of him and Lena on the other. The feeling that went with his picture was like a sharp stick in his stomach. If only he had one of those giant bombs they had in the old days. He imagined they were about the size of watermelons. He would shoot one at Lena. Pow! It would sail halfway to the city and drop right on Casper's truck and blow them all up. Then he would have another one shoot toward the Pioneer Hotel. Blam! It would flatten the building and blow up every one of the cave people. He longed to throw that big bomb. He could almost feel it in his hands. He had come out of the end of the row of plants now, where a small whitewashed storage shed stood at the edge of the field. Crates of tomatoes were stacked nearby, ready to be distributed. Without thinking, Torrin grabbed a tomato from the nearest crate and hurled it against the wall of the shed. It splattered. Red water dripped down the white wall. It felt so good to do it, he did it again. In a fury, he snatched up one tomato after another. Wham! 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 He flung them with all of his might until the window of the shed splintered. The wall was a bleeding mess, and a long mound of broken red flesh laid on the ground. He stopped and took a breath. What would the farmers think when they saw this? 2 whole crates of tomatoes smashed? They'd be so angry. But they wouldn't know who had done it, would they? No one had seen him. And that was when an idea floated into Torrin's mind. A really excellent idea. He smiled thinking about it. He threw one last tomato, aiming for the dark glass tooth hole of the broken window. There was a satisfying crash as a tomato knocked something over. Torrin turned and ran, and he didn't go all the way home. When Dune came through town that morning on the way to work, he found Mrs. Murdo waiting for him by the side of the road. She signaled to him with one finger, and he left the stream of workers and came over to her. Lena has gone off, she said. I thought you should know. Gone off? Gone where? Mrs. Murdo produced a scrap of paper from the pocket of her skirt. Read this, she said. Dune read. He scrunched up his nose in puzzlement. He remembered Lena telling him something the other day about these people, Caspar and Maddie. What had she said? He tried to remember. He looked again at the note. Something important, she says. What would that be? Mrs. Murdo shrugged her thin shoulders. She has ideas in her head, she said. Dune could see that she was worried, though she didn't really say so. Well, she said she'll be back in 2 or 3 days, said Dune. That's not so long. The odd thing is, said Mrs. Murdo, that Caspar, when he left, said he wouldn't be back for several months. Dune frowned. What was Lena up to? He didn't understand, but he didn't want to make Mrs. Murdo more worried than she already was. She must have some plan for getting back, he said, handing back the note. Of course, said Mrs. Murdo briskly. She folded the note and replaced it in her pocket. There's no need to worry. I'll have her come and find you as soon as she returns. She headed back toward the doctor's house, and Dune went toward the field. He walked slowly to give himself time to think. He was upset about Lena. How could she be so foolish as to launch herself out into an unknown world with 2 unknown people? But in a way, he wasn't surprised. Lena was always eager to investigate new places. Look how she'd gone up to the roof of the gathering hall on the very first day she became a messenger in Ember. Look how eager she had been to go down into the pipeworks. She probably just wanted to see what was outside of Sparks. As soon as she satisfied her curiosity, she'd be back. But Dune was upset about Lena for another reason too, and it didn't have to do with her safety. He was upset that she went exploring without him. All through the last days of Ember, they had been partners. Now she had gone off on her own, leaving him here. He was annoyed, and he was hurt. He had to admit to himself that he hadn't been a very good friend to Lena lately. Maybe he hurt her feelings by paying too much attention to Tick. But still, it was Lena who was his partner in important things. If she had an urgent reason for hitching a ride with Caspar, why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't she asked him to come along? He trudged toward the tomato field, head down, scuffing his toes irritably in the dust, and so he didn't really notice until he was right up to it that a commotion was going on by the storage shed. Everyone was crowded around it, and Chugger, the team leader, was yelling. Dune hurried faster to see what was going on. Wasted! Wasted! Chugger was shouting. 2 whole crates smashed. Who did this? And the shed plastered with muck, and the windows broken. Do any of you know about this? He demanded. Anyone mad enough to do this? No one said a word. Dune stared with horror at the mess on the wall. It looked gory, as if it were smashed animals instead of just tomatoes. He could feel the rage of the person who had done this. I don't like this, Chugger said. Nothing like this has ever happened before you people arrived. I want it cleaned up right now. Walls washed, window fixed, mess cleared away. Get on it. Listen, said someone. Dune turned to see that it was Tick speaking. We didn't do this. Don't get all rough with us. Chugger whipped around. Who else would do it? Who else but one of you, always griping and grumbling? We only just got here now. How could we have done it? Someone called out. Besides, we wouldn't. We would never waste food, said someone else. More and more voices rose in protest. Dune added to it, saying, It wasn't us. It couldn't have been. But Chugger just stood and scowled at him. Finally, he yelled, Quiet! Get to work! Just after that, Dune heard running footsteps behind him and turned to see Torin racing across the field. He was shouting in his shrill, high voice as he came. I saw! He cried, waving his arms. Last night I was working here, and I saw! He ran into the midst of the workers and stood panting. I heard a thump, 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 so I snuck up to see, and I did see what happened. Well then, said Chugger, what did you see? I saw who threw the tomatoes. I saw who made that big mess and broke a window. He stood with his neck poked forward and his skinny arms held tight to his sides. His whole body was trembling with excitement. His eyes scanned the group of workers. It was him! He shrieked, pointing straight at Dune. It was him! I saw it! Dune was so shocked he didn't make a sound. He stood with his mouth open, staring at Torin. Around him, a few people spoke up. He did not. He couldn't have. He wouldn't. No, someone else said. He would never do that. But Chugger seized his arm and pulled him roughly aside. What do you have to say for yourself? Is this your doing? Dune shook his head. No. That boy is lying. And why would he say that? Why would he take the trouble to come out here first thing in the morning to point to you and lie? I don't know, said Dune. Chugger released his arm with a push. I'll be keeping a special eye on you from now on, he said. But why? Said Dune. I didn't do this. How do I know that? Said Chugger. It's your word against his, and he's one of us. Wow. Definitely tell me what you think about what just happened and what Torin just did. The next chapter, chapter 15, is called A Long Hot Ride, and we will be reading those tomorrow. I hope everyone has an awesome day. I miss you all. Hope you're getting some sunshine. Looks pretty sunny out today. Me and Jupiter say goodbye.